The Whitmore
Oh, look at the
estate
little
sat on
crybaby.
42
That's enough.
acres
Can't you see
of
she's upset?
immaculate Connecticut
Let her be,
countryside.
ma'am. She's just being
The kind
dramatic.
of property that
Oh,
made
look at the little
passing
crybaby.
strangers
That's
slow
enough.
their
Can't you see
cars
she's
just
upset?
to stare
Let
through
her
the
be,
iron
ma'am.
gates.
She's just being
The
dramatic.
main house,
Oh, look at the
a
little
sprawling
crybaby.
That's
colonial
enough. Can't you see
revival
she's
mansion
upset?
with white
Let her
columns
be, ma'am.
and
She's just being
ivy-threaded
dramatic.
stone walls looked less like a home and more like a declaration. A declaration that said, "Power lives here." And it did. For 33 years, power had lived in the shape of Ethan Whitmore. Ethan had inherited his father's real estate empire at 26 after the old man's sudden heart attack left behind a company in mild disarray and a son who was, by every conventional measure, unprepared. What followed surprised Wall Street, surprised his father's old board of directors, and most of all surprised Ethan himself. Within 4 years, he had tripled the company's net worth, expanded into sustainable development, and earned the kind of profile that landed him on the cover of Forbes with a headline that read, "The Quiet Titan." He wasn't flashy. He didn't party on yachts or post curated images of himself with champagne in places that required a private jet to reach. He was measured, intentional, and largely private, a man who preferred the sound of rain against tall windows to the roar of any crowd. But even quiet titans have blind spots. His name had been linked to Vivian Ashworth for nearly 2 years. She was 29, the daughter of a Boston-based investment banker, educated at Brown, polished in that specific way that comes not from warmth, but from rigorous social training. She was objectively beautiful, the kind of beautiful that photographers loved and ordinary people felt slightly diminished by. Ethan's mother had approved of her with enthusiasm. His board had approved of her with relief. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago, and the society pages had called it a perfect pairing. Ethan had told himself he agreed. It was on a Wednesday in late October that Elena Vasquez arrived at the Whitmore estate with a single rolling suitcase, a sleeping toddler balanced on her hip, and a quiet dignity that asked for nothing. She was 28, recently widowed. Her husband Marco had died in a construction accident 8 months prior, and she had taken the live-in maid position because the apartment she could no longer afford on her grief-stunned salary had given her 60 days' notice. The estate's housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, had hired her after a single interview, describing her to Ethan simply as capable and good. Elena's daughter was named Rosie. Rosie Vasquez was 3 years old, and she was, without any exaggeration, one of those children who seemed to have arrived on the planet already sure of herself. She had her mother's dark eyes and her late father's wide, easy smile, and she had a habit of carrying a small stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanut everywhere she went, pressing his worn trunk against her cheek when the world felt too big. She was not loud. She was not disruptive. She was, as Mrs. Donnelly said after Rosie's first week on the estate, an absolute little soul. Ethan first saw Rosie on a Thursday morning. He had come down to the kitchen earlier than usual, unable to sleep, and found the child sitting at the large kitchen island in her pajamas, eating cereal with the careful concentration of someone performing surgery. She had looked up at him without fear, studied him with those serious dark eyes, and said, "You're tall." He had laughed. Actually laughed. The full, real kind that came from somewhere unguarded. "I am," he had said. "Mr. Peanut is scared of tall people," Rosie had confided, hugging the elephant closer. "But I told him you probably have a nice face." He had stood there for a moment in his expensive pajamas in his 12,000-square-foot home and felt, inexplicably, like he was being seen by someone for the very first time. Elena had rushed in seconds later, apologetic, reaching for Rosie's hand. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore." She slipped out before I could. "It's fine," he had said, and he meant it. "She can eat her cereal." Elena had hesitated, then nodded, and in that brief exchange, he had noticed the shadows beneath her eyes and the way she held herself, upright and capable on the outside, braced against something invisible on the inside. He recognized that posture. He had worn it himself in the months after his father died, when grief was a private country he visited alone every night. He hadn't thought much more about it at the time, or so he told himself. The weeks that followed settled into a routine. Ethan worked. Vivian visited on weekends, floating through the estate like she was already taking inventory. Mrs. Donnelly managed the household with her quiet efficiency. Elena cleaned, cooked breakfast for the small staff, and kept Rosie in the East Wing quarters on the ground floor where a small sitting room had been converted into a makeshift playroom. The arrangement was practical.
Clean. Orderly.
But Rosie had no respect for arrangements. She had a way of appearing where she wasn't expected, sitting on the bottom stair when Ethan came home late from the city, looking up at him with those elephant eyes and saying something like, "Mama said today was hard. Was your day hard too?" She had begun leaving small objects outside his study door. A drawing of what appeared to be a horse, but might have been a dog. A single crayon, always purple. Once, a note that Mrs. Donnelly had transcribed on her behalf that read, "I saved you a cookie, but I eated it, sorry, Rosie." He had taped it to the inside of his desk drawer. He hadn't told anyone that. Elena, for her part, was mortified by each intrusion and apologized with a sincerity that made the apologies themselves feel like small exhaustions. He had told her twice that Rosie wasn't a problem. Elena had smiled the way people smile when they're grateful but have stopped fully believing in good fortune, a smile that kept one hand on the door, ready for the moment things changed. Things changed on a Sunday. Vivian had come for the weekend with a friend from Boston, a woman named Claudia, who wore perfume that arrived 3 seconds before she did. They had taken brunch on the East Terrace, and Ethan had been inside on a call when it happened. He didn't witness it directly. He would learn the details later, from Mrs. Donnelly, who had been present, and whose face when she told him was careful in a way that meant she was choosing every word. Rosie had wandered onto the terrace with Mr. Peanut, drawn by the sound of voices, and had stood near the table with the open, curious expression she wore when she was deciding whether someone was nice. Vivian had looked at the child, this small, dark-eyed girl in a sundress with a stuffed elephant, and had laughed.
Not warmly.
The kind of laugh that has edges. "Oh, look," Vivian had said to Claudia, loud enough that Mrs. Donnelly heard every syllable from the doorway. "The little Maid baby is here." And then, looking directly at Rosie with a smile that didn't reach anything human behind it, she had said, "No one will choose you over me, you little brat. Go back to wherever you came from." Rosie had stood very still. Then she had turned around, walked back inside, and found the nearest corner, where she sat down on the floor, pressed Mr. Peanut's trunk against her cheek, and didn't make a single sound. That was how Elena found her daughter 20 minutes later. And that was the moment something quietly cracked open in the Whitmore estate, something that all the money in Connecticut could not put back together in the shape it had been before. Elena found Rosie in the corner of the hallway outside the kitchen, sitting the way she sometimes sat during thunderstorms, knees pulled to her chest, Mr. Peanut crushed against her face, her small body very still in a way that was worse than crying. Rosie was not a child who hid. She ran toward things, toward people, toward whatever caught her enormous curiosity. She did not fold herself into corners and go quiet. That was not her. Which was exactly why seeing her that way made Elena's chest cave in on itself. She crossed the hallway in 4 steps and dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor without caring about the impact. "Baby.
Hey.
Look at Mama." She cupped Rosie's face in both hands and tilted it gently upward, and what she saw in her daughter's eyes was not tears, not yet, but something worse, a confusion that was working its way toward a question Elena wasn't ready to answer. The question of why. The question of what did I do? The question that 3-year-olds should never have to carry because the answer, the real answer is nothing. You did nothing. The cruelty was never about you. But how do you explain the architecture of adult smallness to someone who still believes that everyone's heart is roughly as open as her own? A lady said something. Rosie said carefully. She was precise with her words for a child her age, had been since before she turned 2. Marco used to say she'd been saving up language in some other life and arrived ready to use it. The memory of him saying that landed in Elena's chest like it always did, swift and soft and bruising. I know, sweetheart. Elena pulled her daughter into her arms and held her the way she had learned to hold her in the months after Marco died, when Rosie had started waking at night reaching for a father who wasn't there. The hold that said, I'm here. I'm still here. This is not the end of anything. She said no one will choose me. Rosie said into Elena's shoulder. Her voice was not shaking, but it was slow, the way voices get when a person is thinking while they're talking. What does choose mean like that? Elena closed her eyes. The question was a small knife, and it turned. It means pick, Elena said, keeping her voice even. Like choosing her favorite color. Blue, said Rosie immediately. And then, after a pause. But why would someone not pick me? Someone said something unkind, Elena said. And unkind things don't become true just because someone says them. You understand. Rosie considered this with the gravity she brought to all important matters. Like when Tommy at the park said Mr. Peanut is ugly? Exactly like that. Mr. Peanut is not ugly. He is the handsomest elephant I have ever seen. Rosie leaned back and looked at her mother's face in that searching, X-ray way she had, looking for the tremble, the tell, the thing adults tried to hide behind composed expressions. Elena held her face steady. She had become very good at that in the past 8 months, at holding her face steady while the inside of her did something different entirely. Okay, Rosie said at last, with a trust that was the most sacred thing Elena possessed. Okay, Mama. Mrs. Donnelly appeared in the doorway then, holding a glass of water that Elena hadn't asked for, but that was offered in the way of a woman who had been navigating other people's pain for 40 years, quietly, practically, without fanfare. Drink something, she said to Elena, and her eyes said considerably more than that. They said, I saw. I'm sorry. You don't deserve this. She doesn't deserve this. Elena took the glass and drank. What she didn't know, as she sat on that hallway floor with her daughter in her arms and her dignity carefully reassembled around her like something she wore because she had to, was that 40 feet away and 2 rooms over, Ethan Whitmore had come off his phone call and walked toward the East Terrace to rejoin his guests. He had passed through the sitting room. He had heard Vivian's voice through the glass door, carrying with that specific clarion quality it had when she was performing for an audience. And he had heard the tail end of something that stopped him where he stood. No one will choose you over me, you little brat. He had stood very still. He was a man who had built a career on the ability to assess situations with clarity and without the distortion of emotion. He had sat across from people who had lied to him in boardrooms, people who had tried to diminish him, people who had mistaken his quietness for weakness, and paid the professional price for that miscalculation. He understood the vocabulary of power used as a weapon. He had seen it deployed by experts. He had never expected to hear it aimed at a 3-year-old. He didn't go out to the terrace. He stood in the sitting room for a long moment, and then he walked, slowly, to the kitchen, where Mrs. Donnelly was returning from the hallway with an empty water glass and an expression that confirmed everything. He looked at her. She looked at him. Where is the child? He asked. Her mother has her, Mrs. Donnelly said. They're all right. He nodded. He poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, and inside him something that had been bending for a while, something he had refused to name, had redirected every time it tried to surface, had buried under schedules and social expectations and other people's versions of what his life should look like, went very, very quiet. That kind of quiet that isn't emptiness. The kind that comes right before a decision. On the terrace, Vivian was laughing at something Claudia had said, and the sound of it traveled through the glass and arrived in the kitchen perfectly clear. It was a beautiful laugh. It had always been a beautiful laugh. That was part of the thing about Vivian. The beauty was real, the poise was real, the intelligence was real. But somewhere inside all of that real and polished exterior was something that had looked at a 3-year-old girl holding a stuffed elephant and felt threatened, felt the need to wound, had chosen cruelty towards someone small and defenseless and alone on a terrace, and had done it with a smile. Ethan thought about his own childhood, about being 8 years old and sitting outside his father's study door at midnight because the shouting inside had woken him and he didn't know what to do except be near the door. About his mother's face in those years, composed, always composed, the same held steadiness that he had just seen on Elena Vasquez's face in the corner of a hallway while she held her daughter and told her that unkind words don't become true. His mother had told him the same thing once. He had believed it because she believed it, because she held her face steady and her voice stayed even and her arms stayed around him, and that steadiness was the thing he had built himself on. That steadiness was the reason he could sit in a boardroom full of people trying to dismantle him and not flinch. Elena was doing that for Rosie. In a hallway, in someone else's house, while working a job she needed to survive. She was doing the hardest, most important thing a parent can do, with no one watching, with no one acknowledging it, with no reward and no recognition, just the pure and total commitment to making sure her daughter's world did not crack along the fault lines that someone else's cruelty had tried to introduce. He thought about the note in his desk drawer. "I saved you a cookie, but I eat it, sorry, Rosie." Something in the kitchen shifted. Not the furniture, not the light. Something interior and tectonic. He set down the water glass. He went back to his study. He did not go to the terrace. When Vivian came inside an hour later and found him at his desk, she said, "You missed a lovely brunch," and kissed him on the cheek, and he said, "I had calls," and she accepted this the way she accepted most things about him, as a feature of the landscape, not a signal worth reading. That night he lay awake and looked at the ceiling and understood something clearly for the first time in longer than he could honestly admit. The life he was building and the life he actually wanted had never quite been the same thing. He had been calling them the same thing for convenience, for efficiency, for the sake of other people's timelines and expectations. 40 feet below him, in the East Wing, Rosie Vasquez slept with Mr. Peanut under her chin, and Elena sat at the small desk by the window doing the household accounts she'd offered to manage because it made her feel useful, and the October wind moved through the Connecticut trees outside, and the Whitmore estate was very quiet. And in the quiet, something was beginning. The morning after the terrace incident, Ethan did something he had not done in the nearly 2 months since Elena and Rosie had arrived at the estate. He came to the kitchen at 7 a.m., not early, not rushed, but deliberately, and he sat at the island. And he waited. Elena arrived at 7:15, Rosie on her hip, and stopped when she saw him. He was in a gray sweater and dark trousers, no tie, no armor, which was its own statement for a man who used formality as distance. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and another cup steaming beside it, and he nodded toward the second cup and said, "Mrs. Donnelly said you take it with sugar." Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way of someone deciding whether a room was safe. Then she crossed to the island and sat Rosie on the stool beside her and took the coffee and said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore."
"Ethan," he said.
He had said it before. She never used it. She nodded, which was not agreement, but wasn't refusal either. Rosie looked at him. She had her elephant. She had not yet decided, it seemed, how she felt about this kitchen encounter. She had a slight seriousness around her eyes that hadn't been there the week before, something careful, and seeing it in a 3-year-old face made Ethan's chest do something uncomfortable. "Good morning, Rosie," he said. She studied him.
Good morning, she said.
And then, after a pause of consideration, "Are you sad?" Elena made a small, involuntary sound. "Why do you ask?" Ethan said. "You look like Mama looks when she's sad but doing her face," Rosie said, with the devastating perceptiveness of small children everywhere. Doing her face was, apparently, what Rosie called composure. The held steadiness. The expression that said, "I'm fine," while the interior said something else entirely. Elena was looking fixedly at her coffee cup. "I might be thinking hard," Ethan said. "Thinking hard and sad can look similar." Rosie appeared to accept this. "Mr. Peanut thinks hard sometimes," she offered, extending an olive branch in the form of personal elephant information. "Does he?" Ethan said, and his voice was gentle, genuinely gentle, in a way that Elena heard without looking up. "He thinks about bananas," Rosie said very seriously. "He likes bananas, but we don't always have them." "We can fix that," Ethan said, and looked at Elena. "We'll make sure there are always bananas." Elena looked up then. He was looking at her, not at Rosie when he said it, and they both understood that bananas were not what he was talking about. The sentence was doing double work, the way sentences sometimes do when the real thing is too large to approach directly. He was saying, "I know something happened. I know she was hurt. I intend to do something about the conditions that allowed it." He was saying it in the safe language of fruit and stuffed elephants because they were in a kitchen at 7 in the morning and Elena was his employee, and there were 17 layers of propriety and practicality between who they each were and whatever this moment was trying to become. But Elena heard it. He knew she heard it. The space between them was briefly so honest it was almost unbearable, and then Rosie said, "Can I have cereal?" And the moment passed into the ordinary, which was perhaps a mercy. Later that morning, Ethan called Vivian. Not to have the conversation, not the full one, not yet. He wasn't a man who moved without thinking, and he had learned, at considerable cost, that emotional decisions made at peak feeling tended to miss things. But he needed to say something, and he needed her to hear him say it, and so he called and he asked, directly, what had happened on the terrace. There was a pause. "Oh." The little girl wandered out and interrupted. Vivian said, breezy, unbothered. "I might have said something sharp. You know how I am when I'm relaxing and something disrupts the—" "She's 3 years old, Vivian." Another pause. A different quality to this one. "She's the child of a staff member, Ethan. I'm not going to pretend I don't have preferences about who interrupts my weekend." "She's a child," he said. "That's the only category that matters in this context. You're being dramatic." He thought about the corner of the hallway, about the way Rosie had been sitting, about the specific, kind of still that isn't peace. "I need you to apologize to her," he said. The silence on the other end was long enough to have its own weather system. "You want me to apologize?" "To a toddler. Because she wandered onto a terrace and I asked her to leave." "That's not what you did, Ethan." "I heard you," he said, simply, quietly. "I was in the sitting room. I heard what you said to her." The call did not end well. It did not end with screaming or dramatic declarations. Vivian was too controlled for that. But it ended with a cold efficiency that told him everything about how she had filed this disagreement, under Ethan being irrational and something to be managed. She would come next weekend, she said. They would talk then. She said it the way people say things they expect to resolve in their favor once the other person has had time to return to their senses. He hung up and sat for a long time at his desk. The purple crayon from 2 weeks ago was still sitting in the corner of his desk where he'd put it. He hadn't moved it. He told himself it was because he hadn't gotten around to it, which was, he now recognized, a lie he had been telling himself about something that had nothing to do with the crayon. That afternoon, he did something else he hadn't done before. He went to the East Wing. He knocked on the open door of the small sitting room that had been converted into Rosie's play space, and found Elena sitting on the floor helping Rosie with a puzzle, and both of them looked up. "May I?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the floor. Elena blinked. "Of course," she said, and then added Mr. Whitmore because she still couldn't entirely stop herself. He sat down on the floor. In his gray sweater and his good trousers, Ethan Whitmore, whose office was on the 41st floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan and whose net worth had 7 digits before the decimal point, sat cross-legged on a play mat covered in jungle animals and picked up a puzzle piece. Rosie watched this development with enormous seriousness. Then she handed him another piece. "That one goes by the giraffe," she said.
"Thank you," he said.
They did the puzzle, the three of them, on the floor for 40 minutes, while the October sun moved across the play mat and Mr. Peanut supervised from his position propped against the baseboard. Elena said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes and then gradually began to speak about Rosie, about the puzzle, about nothing of consequence, and her voice was different here than it was when she was working. It was quieter and less braced, and more like something that belonged to her rather than something she deployed. He listened to her voice and thought about the 8 months she'd been carrying things alone, and didn't say any of that. Just listened. When he left to take a call, Rosie followed him to the door of the sitting room, held up Mr. Peanut and said, "He likes you." "I'm glad," Ethan said. "It's a big deal," Rosie said. "He doesn't like everybody." He walked back to his study with a feeling that he had just been given something small and made of stuffed cotton and enormous trust, and that he had better be worthy of it. Vivian came the following Saturday exactly as she'd said she would, and she brought with her the particular energy of someone who had spent a week preparing to win an argument. She was immaculate, cream coat, dark jeans, hair that looked effortless and cost more than effortless, and she kissed Ethan at the door and said, "You look tired," which was her way of saying you should stop whatever you've been doing that has made you look like this. He had been sleeping, in fact, better than he had in months. He didn't say that. They had dinner at the long table in the formal dining room, just the two of them, with candles that Vivian had requested and wine she had selected, and the conversation moved through comfortable social channels. Her friend's engagement, a charity gala, a project his company was developing in Denver, and it was all smooth and practiced and strangely exhausting, the way things become when you are paying close attention to what is not being said. After dinner he said, quietly, "I'd like to revisit our conversation from last week." Vivian set down her wine glass. She had known it was coming and had prepared accordingly. "I've thought about it," she said. "And I understand you feel protective of the staff, which I actually think is admirable. But I think you're conflating an isolated moment of impatience with a character judgment, and that's not entirely fair." "I told you what I heard," he said. "You heard me be short with a child who interrupted a private gathering. That's not a moral failing, Ethan. That's a human moment. Calling a 3-year-old a brat is not a human moment. Children can be." "She was standing on a terrace holding a stuffed elephant," he said. "She wasn't doing anything. She was just there. And you told her no one would choose her over you." He paused. "She's 3 years old, and she'd just lost her father. She didn't understand why someone would say that to her. She sat in a corner for 20 minutes trying to figure out what she'd done wrong." Something moved across Vivian's face, quickly, there and then gone. It might have been the beginning of something like remorse. Or it might have been the beginning of a recalculation. He had become, over the preceding week, less certain that he could tell the difference. "I will speak to the mother," Vivian said, "and offer an apology. Is that what you need?" "I asked you to apologize to Rosie."
"Ethan."
"She's a toddler. She won't remember." He looked at her across the candlelight and felt something settle into place in his chest. Not a collapse, but a clarification. The kind that comes when something you've been refusing to see becomes suddenly visible, not because it changed, but because you finally stopped looking away. "I'll remember," he said. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does that mean?" "It means the kind of person who can look at a child that age and choose to hurt her. I will remember that. I won't be able to not remember it." The dinner ended without resolution. They went to bed with the silence of two people who have drawn their positions and know the terrain between them has shifted into something that cannot be easily crossed. In the morning, Vivian was dressed and ready to leave before 9, and she came to his study and stood in the doorway and said, with the controlled precision of someone who is hurt but will not allow you to see how much, "I think you should decide what you actually want. Because I'm beginning to think it isn't what you said it was." He looked at her. She was right. She was, in this particular thing, completely right, and the fairness of it cost him something. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it. She left. He sat at his desk for a long time after her car disappeared down the drive. The engagement ring she hadn't taken off. She would make him ask for that, which was both her right and her cruelty, and he understood both, glittered in his memory like a small accusation. He would call a jeweler on Monday. He would call his mother on Sunday and prepare for the conversation that would be long and detailed and painful in the way of people who love you and have invested in a version of your future. He opened his desk drawer. The note from Rosie was there, in Mrs. Donnelly's handwriting. "I saved you a cookie, but I eated it, sorry, Rosie." He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the purple crayon. He picked up his phone and called not his mother and not his lawyer, but Mrs. Donnelly, and he asked her if Elena had her day off tomorrow as scheduled, and Mrs. Donnelly said yes, and he said, "Can you let her know I'd like to speak with her sometime this week, at her convenience, no urgency?" Mrs. Donnelly said she would. And then she said, in the particular careful tone she used when she was trying not to show that she was pleased, "Is there anything else, Mr. Whitmore?" "No," he said. "That's all." "Very good," she said. And he could hear the smile she wasn't showing him, and it was, despite everything, a comfort. The following Tuesday, Elena knocked on his study door during the afternoon quiet, when Rosie was napping. She stood in the doorway with a composure that was doing the thing it always did, covering something more complicated and more real, and she said, "Mrs. Donnelly said you wanted to speak with me." "Come in," he said. "Please." She came in and sat across from his desk, and he thought about moving the chairs, about making it less like a meeting, and then he thought that she might actually find the desk a comfort, that the formality might feel like protection, and so he left it. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for what happened on the terrace. It happened in my home. I should have ensured that." "You don't need to." "I do," he said gently. "It was my house. She was in my house. That's my responsibility." He paused. "I also wanted to ask how Rosie is." Elena looked at him for a moment. "She's okay," she said. "She's resilient." And then, more quietly, "She's a lot like her dad was. Things move through her instead of settling." He heard the past tense land and didn't look away from it. "He died 8 months ago," he said. Not a question. He knew the timeline, but an acknowledgement. An opening for her to speak if she wanted to. Something in Elena's composure shifted. Not broke. She didn't break. He was beginning to understand that she was constitutionally incapable of just breaking, but allowed a small, real thing to surface. 8 months and 4 days, she said. Not that I'm counting in that way. Just that the days are still pretty distinct. I know something about that, he said. My father. 7 years ago. She looked at him with recognition, the specific recognition that passes between people who have learned grief from the inside. Does it get less distinct? She asked, and it was the first time she had asked him anything directly personal, and the openness of it told him that she was tired, on this Tuesday afternoon, of carrying it alone. "It gets less sharp," he said. "It doesn't get smaller. Just less sharp." She nodded. She believed him. He could tell, because it sounded true rather than comforting, and she had become, 8 months and 4 days in, a connoisseur of the difference. They sat in his study for another 20 minutes and talked about nothing that would have looked significant from the outside. He asked about Rosie's favorite books, and she told him, a particular series about a bear who bakes, and he asked if they had them all, and she said they were missing the third one, and he made a mental note. She asked what he was working on, and he told her about the Denver project, the sustainable building materials, and she asked 2 genuinely intelligent questions about community impact that surprised him into a longer answer than he'd intended. When she left, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." He almost let it go. Then, "Ethan." She paused at the door, turned, and for the first time, with a small, real, unguarded smile that had nothing performed about it, she said, "Thank you, Ethan." He looked at the purple crayon on his desk for a long time after she'd gone. November came with cold clarity and stripped the Connecticut trees bare, and the Whitmore estate turned inward the way old houses do in winter. Fires in the grates, warm light in windows, the smell of wood smoke drifting through tall rooms. Ethan had given Mrs. Donnelly a week off for Thanksgiving and had, almost without planning it, ended up cooking with Elena in the big kitchen while Rosie sat on the island in her pajamas helping, which meant enthusiastically adding flour to things that did not require flour and narrating Mr. Peanut's opinions about cranberry sauce. He was skeptical. It was the most uncomplicated evening Ethan could remember in years. His mother had visited twice since the engagement ended. The first visit had been difficult. Her disappointment was genuine, and she expressed it with the thorough precision of a woman who had invested significant emotional capital in a particular future. He had listened to all of it. He had not argued. He had said, finally, Vivian looked at a grieving child and tried to make her feel worthless. "I can't build a life on that foundation." His mother had gone quiet. She was, underneath the social architecture, a woman of genuine principle, and the principle, when it landed. The second visit, she had brought a book from the Bear Who Bakes series. The third one, the missing volume. She had given it to Rosie in the sitting room, and Rosie had pressed it to her chest and looked up at this tall, elegant woman and said, with her vast and solemn seriousness, "This is the one Mama said we didn't have." And Ethan's mother had looked at this 3-year-old girl with her dark eyes and her stuffed elephant and her absolute certainty that she was deserving of good things, and her own eyes had done something complicated, and she had said, "Well, now you do." And Rosie had said, "Thank you. Mr. Peanut says you're very nice." And his mother had laughed, actually laughed, in a way he hadn't heard in years. After Rosie had gone to bed that evening, his mother had found him in the kitchen, and she had said, simply, "She's extraordinary." He had said, "She is." His mother had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Her mother is too." He hadn't answered that. But he hadn't argued, either, and his mother was a fluent reader of what he didn't say. The days moved through November and into early December, and things shifted on the estate in the way that large things shift, not dramatically, not in single moments you could point to, but in accumulation. The accumulation of mornings in the kitchen, of evenings when he would find himself drifting toward the sound of Rosie's laughter from the sitting room, of conversations with Elena that lengthened past practicality, past the point where either of them had estate business to discuss, and into the territory of just talking about her parents, still living in New Mexico, about his company, and whether success had turned out to mean what he'd thought it meant, about Marco, cautiously at first, and then more fully, as she trusted him with the shape of the person she'd lost. He did not rush anything. He was constitutionally incapable of rushing the things that mattered. He had learned from business, from loss, from the specific education of watching his father mistake speed for decisiveness, that the most important things required the patience to let them become what they actually were rather than what you needed them to be. He also understood, with clarity, that Elena's situation required a particular care that went beyond his own feelings. She was living in his house. She was working for him. The power differential was real, and he held it, and he was not a man who pretended structural realities didn't exist for the convenience of his own desires. He would not make her feel that her position was contingent on reciprocating something. He would not create a situation where she felt she had to. And so he was careful. He was also, by mid-December, running out of room to be careful in. It was Rosie who broke the impasse, because Rosie was 3 and had not yet learned the elaborate social geometry that kept adults from saying the obvious thing. It was a Sunday afternoon, first real snow of the season coming down outside the tall windows, and Ethan had come into the sitting room to drop off a package, the complete set of the Bear Who Bakes series, because he'd tracked down 2 more volumes he wasn't sure they had, and found Elena on the floor with Rosie doing what appeared to be a very important ceremony involving Mr. Peanut, a tea set, and several stuffed animals arranged in a circle of apparent significance. "You have to sit," Rosie informed him, gesturing at the floor with the authority of a small general. He sat. He was handed a small plastic teacup. He drank from it with appropriate gravity. Elena was watching him with that expression she sometimes had, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was doing the work of one, something warm and soft and slightly wondering, as if she was still occasionally surprised by him. "Ethan is invited to all the tea parties now," Rosie announced to the assembled animals. "He is an official friend." She looked at him with those serious eyes. "That means you have to always be around," she said. "Official friends can't leave." Elena made a small sound. "Rosie, sweetheart." "I mean to stay," Ethan said quietly. He wasn't looking at the animals. He was looking at Elena. "If that's all right." The sitting room was very quiet except for the snow wind. Elena looked at him. The composure was there. It was always there. She was built of it. But underneath it, in her eyes, was something unguarded and large and real. 8 months of solitude. 8 months of doing her face and holding steady and being strong for Rosie, while the inside of her did what grief does in the private hours. And here, in a sitting room with a plastic teacup and a stuffed elephant and the snow coming down, was someone who had come in from his 41 floors and sat on the floor and stayed. "It's all right," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. Rosie looked between them with the all-seeing attention of small children and seemed to conclude that something important had been decided, and so she poured more invisible tea and moved on to matters of greater immediacy, which was whether the bear in the corner needed a different hat. That evening, after Rosie was asleep, Elena found Ethan in the kitchen making tea, real tea this time, and she stood in the doorway and said, "I don't have a simple life to offer." "I know," he said. "She comes first. She always comes first." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. And he meant it with a directness that left no room for interpretation. He had watched this woman hold her daughter's world together with nothing but steadiness and love and the unwavering commitment to making sure Rosie never, not once, doubted that she was completely chosen. That was not a complication. That was the whole point. "I'm still figuring out who I am without Marco," she said quietly. I'm not saying that as a warning. I'm saying it because I want to be honest with you. I'm not asking you to have it figured out, he said. I'm asking if I can be here while you do. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed to the counter and picked up the second cup of tea he had made, without asking, without being told, the way you do when you know someone's rhythms, and she wrapped both hands around it and said, "Yes." Outside, the snow came down on the Connecticut countryside, and the Whitmore estate was lit from within. Spring arrived the way it does in New England. tentatively, then all at once, the estate's grounds erupting into color that seemed almost aggressive after the long gray months. The cherry trees along the East Drive bloomed in clouds of pink, and Rosie, now 3.5, ran through them every morning with Mr. Peanut held above her head like a banner, convinced she could catch petals with an elephant. The world had changed. Not loudly, not in the dramatic public register that changed world stories often claim, but changed fully in the way of things that grow rather than erupt. Ethan's board had noticed a different quality to him in the winter months, something easier, something more present. His longtime COO, a sharp woman named Patricia who had worked beside him for 6 years, had said over coffee in February, "You seem like you're actually here lately. Before, you were always half somewhere else." He had thought about that and found it accurate. He had spent years being half somewhere else. At the next deal, the next milestone, the next version of a life he was always building toward rather than living.
He was here now.
Elena had found over the winter months that the grief did not become smaller, as Ethan had said, but the sharpness changed quality, became less a blade and more a weight she knew how to carry, that she had, in fact, built the muscle for without realizing. She talked about Marco with Rosie in the deliberate, loving way she had committed to, keeping him present, keeping him real, honoring the fact that her daughter deserved to know her father, even through memory. Ethan had asked about Marco and she had told him, and he had listened the way he listened to everything, fully, without rushing toward his own response, giving the words their full space. She had come to understand that this quality of attention, of being actually present in the room with another person, was rarer than any of the obvious things people listed when they talked about what they wanted. Rarer than wealth, rarer than looks, rarer than the polished charm that Vivian had possessed and deployed. Ethan was here. He was here in the kitchen and on the sitting room floor and in the conversations that lasted past midnight when Rosie was asleep and the house was quiet, and they were just two people talking in the particular honesty that comes late at night when the defenses have gone to bed before you have. She had fallen in love carefully and completely, the way she did most important things. And Rosie had, by her own 3-year-old lights, decided on Ethan sometime around the official tea party and had not revised her position. She called him Ethan with a familiarity that made Mrs. Donnelly smile into her apron. She saved him drawings. She narrated Mr. Peanut's opinions to him with the expectation that he would take them seriously, which he always did. She had begun, in recent weeks, a habit of climbing onto his lap during the after-dinner hour when he read, and she was supposed to be settling before bedtime, just arriving, arranging herself, and falling asleep with Mr. Peanut under her chin, as though his lap was a place that had always been hers. He would sit very still when this happened, not wanting to move, not wanting the hour to end. On an April Saturday, Ethan's mother came for the weekend with 2 of his oldest friends, a couple named James and Claire who had known him since graduate school and who arrived prepared to evaluate, in the kind way of people who love you and want to understand who you are now. They had heard. Everyone in Ethan's orbit had heard, in the elliptical way these things travel. Engagement ended, something changed, there's someone. They had come to see. What they saw, within the first hour, was this: Ethan moving through his own house differently. Not the braced, slightly performing quality he'd had at his own dinner parties for years, the host going through the hospitable motions, but something loose and easy and genuinely at home. They saw Elena at the kitchen island while Ethan cooked, handing him things without being asked, laughing at something he said with a laugh that was completely real and completely hers. They saw Rosie career into the kitchen, stop at James and Claire with a focused gaze of a border inspector, accept their introduction with gravity, and then climb into Ethan's arms with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. James had met Vivian twice. He had found her impressive and somehow diminishing at the same time, and had kept that opinion to himself for 2 years. He looked at Ethan now, with Rosie on his hip explaining to him very seriously that they needed to get bananas for Mr. Peanut, and he looked at Claire, and Claire looked back at him, and 20 years of marriage conveyed in a glance. Yes.
This.
The moment that shocked everyone, the answer that reverberated outward, that traveled through the Whitmore social circle and eventually reached Vivian, though she never acknowledged it, and reached the society press, though it was too quiet a moment for them to properly render, happened over dinner. They were all at the long table together, estate formality entirely abandoned, food passed family style, wine poured, Rosie in her booster seat at the corner with a small plate and an opinion about everything. His mother was talking about a garden renovation she was considering. James was telling a story about a disastrous work trip. Claire was asking Elena about her family in New Mexico with genuine warm interest, and Elena was answering with the open, real warmth she gave when she trusted a room, and she trusted this room. Ethan had made sure of that, had made sure of it quietly over months by being consistently, reliably himself. Rosie, who had been eating with the focused intensity she brought to meals, looked up at some point in the general noise and said, loudly and clearly and with the perfect, unself-conscious honesty of a child who has not yet learned to bury the obvious, "Ethan, are you going to be my daddy?" The table went still. Ethan's mother's face went through 5 distinct expressions in approximately 1 second. Elena looked at her daughter and then at Ethan with an expression that tried to be composed and was not quite managing it. Not embarrassment exactly, but a held-breath quality, an openness to whatever came next that was so vulnerable it was almost painful to witness. Rosie, unconcerned by the stillness, looked at Ethan with enormous, patient, dark eyes and waited. She had asked a simple question. She expected a real answer. That was how she operated. Ethan set down his fork. He looked at this child, this small, serious, magnificent 3-year-old girl who had looked at him in a kitchen 7 months ago and said, "You're tall," and handed him a cereal question and called him an official friend and fallen asleep on his lap with an elephant under her chin. And he felt something complete and settled move through him. The same thing he felt when a deal stopped being a deal and became a commitment. When a direction stopped being a calculation and became a truth. "I would like to be," he said, "if your mama decides that's what she wants. And if you'll have me." He looked at Elena when he said the second part. The table was so quiet that the April wind outside was audible. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and her face, that face she had learned to hold steady through 8 months of grief and solitude and carrying her daughter's world, finally, fully, stopped holding anything. Just let everything through. Everything she had been braced against and everything she had slowly, carefully, completely stopped bracing against over the winter, and her eyes were bright and her voice, when she spoke, was small and real and entirely hers. "She'll have you," Elena said. "We both will." Rosie appeared satisfied. She looked at Mr. Peanut. "I told you," she said to the elephant, with the gravity of a prophet vindicated. "I told you he had a nice face." The table broke into laughter and sound, and James raised his glass, and Claire wiped her eyes without pretending she wasn't, and Ethan's mother pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of people who are grateful and are deciding whether to admit how much. Later, much later, after Rosie was asleep and the guests were settled and the house had gone quiet again, Elena and Ethan stood on the East Terrace, the same terrace where someone had once looked at her daughter with cold eyes and said, "No one will choose you," and the April night was warm and the cherry trees were dark shapes in the moonlight and the estate was utterly still. Elena looked out at the grounds and Ethan stood beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and she said, "She was wrong, you know." The woman who said that to her. "She was wrong," he agreed. "You chose her," Elena said quietly. "You chose her before you chose anything else."
He thought about this.
About the morning in the kitchen with the cereal. About the purple crayon and the eaten cookie and the sitting room floor. About the patience of a child who had stood in a corner for 20 minutes trying to understand cruelty and then gotten up and gone back to living because that was what the people who loved her had shown her you do. "She made it easy," he said. Elena looked at him, and her smile was the full and unguarded one, the one she gave now without bracing, without one hand on the door.
"She does that," she said.
Above them, in the East Wing, Rosie Vasquez slept with Mr. Peanut under her chin, in a house that was hers, in a life that was choosing her back with its whole heart. And that was the answer. The one that shocked everyone who had expected something loud. The one that turned out to be not a single moment, but a season of them, accumulated quietly, in kitchens and sitting rooms and on sitting room floors, in the patient language of tea parties and purple crayons and bananas. The answer was, you were always worth choosing. You were never anything less. It just took the right person to say it out loud.